Elon's promise of a full audit of Fort Knox.
Well, I hope you're going to use your joke now, Dominic, because I love that joke about the Fort Knox audit.
Yeah. Come on then. Come on.
So the head of security goes to the US president. He says, Mr. President, there's no gold in Fort Knox. And the US president says, what do you mean there's no gold in Fort Knox? And the head of security says, there's no gold in Fort Knox. And the president says, double the guard.
What's happening to gold? Is the so-called debasement trade over? Have we just seen another FOMO-driven momentum bubble hit a blowout top? Is that it for another decade? Of course, a bubble is a bull market that we're not involved in. And from the outside, the recent frenzy over gold is just another case of market hysteria. Conspiracy theories like the dollar debasement trade are just, well, conspiracy theories, aren't they? Well, this week I invited two long-standing and respected sound money advocates to share their thoughts on gold, where it came from, where it might be heading, and why. We had a great chat. Dominic Frisby has recently published his latest book, The Secret History of Gold, Myth, Money, Politics and Power, and is also the man behind the excellent Flying Frisby Substack. Wealth manager Tim Price of Price Value Partners is also the author of Investing Through the Looking Glass, a rational guide to irrational financial markets. We discussed why gold is valuable, why the gold price has recently been so strong, and how investors should think about gold as an investment asset in a world of government deficits, spiraling debt, and uncertain geopolitics. But as ever, none of what you're about to hear is any kind of advice. But hopefully it is informative and entertaining. Please take personal, professional advice before investing a penny of your money in these crazy markets. And with that, please enjoy my conversation with Dominic Frisby and Tim Price.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.
Dominic, congratulations on the book. It was a great read, and just as I suggested it might when we chatted almost exactly a year ago, its publication seems to have marked the top in precious metals prices, so well done you.
I think that's being a little bit unfair. It was published in August and the top was last week, and I think it's only an interim top. I don't think it's the top.
I'd also like to bring you in, Tim. You've reviewed The Secret History of Gold, and I think you enjoyed it as well. And you're an investor who's famously a gold bug.
To be described as a gold bug implies that the speaker is a paper bug. And all I would suggest, and I suspect I'll have Dominic's support, is that history's on my side, because gold's been money for 6,000 years and paper's never lasted. I think it was Voltaire pointed out that all paper currencies ultimately trade at their intrinsic value, which is zero.
I totally and wholeheartedly agree. So forgive me.
But not
my pejorative term.
Bitter.
We're shifting the Overton window, and that's what we need to do.
Yeah, debasement trade, as mentioned by JP Morgan. I mean, who'd have thought?
Yeah.
Tim, what were your main takeaways? What did you learn from it?
There's one specific one that might appear trivial, but I think it's actually quite a profound one. One of my favourite bits was the sequences related to all of the jiggery pokery that went on during the Second World War. Lots of stories there about extricating gold under mysterious circumstances that I'd never read before. And I suggested that Hollywood could probably make about a dozen films out of those various little dramas. That was certainly a revelation to me. But the one that really sort of brought it home for me was there's reference to the conquistadors. I don't know whether it was the Aztecs or the Incas, and they were basically wholesale just stealing everything. And there's a reference on Dominic's part referring to the fact that these probably priceless pieces of art were just melted down for their bullion value. And we met with a client literally a week ago, and he has connections in the jewelry trade, and he was saying exactly the same things happening. That he found it very saddening that you've got people melting down genuinely lovely pieces of art now just for their bullion value, for their scrap value almost. And it just struck me that in the course of 400 or 500 years, nothing's changed about human nature whatsoever. And it's really quite sad.
It's really sad. One of the lines I use in the book, more or less, is gold lasts forever. Art made from gold rarely does. And this has just been a repeating pattern because once you melt down gold and resmelt it, its provenance is impossible to prove. One of the first things people have done if they have stolen art is to melt it down for that very reason, because then you don't have the issue with proving its provenance. But also, a lot of the time, the thief melts down the art because he's stealing the gold. He doesn't care about the art. But it happened with the conquistadors. It happened with the Germans. The Germans also would, for example, any gold they stole, and some of the ways they stole gold, Himmler had a thing in the concentration camps where they would extract gold from the teeth of the people put in the concentration camps. They just melted it down and resmelted it and stamped it with pre-1930 stamps, because gold with post-1930 Nazi stamps was unacceptable in the markets, but pre-1930 was okay. So they stamped it with the pre-1930 stuff. But yeah, the South American artisans were superior to the European artisans, but the Spanish conquistadors would just take the gold, melt it down and send it home. And even when they sent the gold back to Spain as art, it usually got melted down back in Spain anyway. So none of that Inca and Aztec art survived. The Incas were the great goldsmiths. Across all South America, they were pretty advanced, but the Incas were the really good ones.
It's the flip side of gold's fungibility, isn't it?
Yeah, there's so many contradictions with gold. One of the contradictions is, I make the argument that gold is a force for peace because, for example, in World War I, had we stuck to the gold standards, the discipline of gold would have meant there wasn't the gold to pay for the war, and the war would have had to have ended a lot sooner than it did. So in that sense, gold is a force for peace because it places limitations on what governments can do. But at the same time, most wars have been waged, or many wars have been waged with the purpose of getting the gold stocks and stealing the gold off the enemy. So gold is both a cause of war and a cause of peace.
Yes, that dilemma came through to me in the book, but some of those stories, particularly the story that sticks in my head, is the one of Norway's gold in World War II. What surprised you most about researching the book, Dominic?
I suppose all the story about the Japanese gold, and as a result of the Japanese gold, reading about Japanese war atrocities and learning that Japanese atrocities were worse than German atrocities. But then after the war, everything that happened to the Nazis went through the courts, and so everyone learnt about what the Nazis had done because they were so ruthlessly tried and it was all fully disclosed. Whereas with the Japanese, it was all buried. And that was largely handled by the Americans, whereas what happened to the Germans was a bit more multinational, their trials. But, and many of the worst Japanese perpetrators just walked scot-free and in fact remained in power. And then we just don't know what happened to all the gold the Japanese stole. It's just not known, and they stole more than the Nazis did. I found that incredible. I still do. You can hear by my tone of voice when I talk about it.
Why is gold valuable?
Because it's rare and because it's beautiful.
And it endures.
Yeah, it lasts forever. The only way you can destroy gold is with nuclear reactions or dissolving it in aqua regia or mercury or whatever. But in the natural world, there's nothing that can destroy gold. You actually have to go out of your way and do something scientifically advanced. And even then, you can recover the gold if you dissolve it in acid. Basically, gold is permanent. It never changes. It's constant. So I say to touch gold is the closest you will ever come to touching eternity, because the gold was there before the earth was.
Doesn't it predate the creation of the solar system?
Yeah, it does. And that doesn't matter what your narrative. If your narrative is divine creation, or if your narrative is interstellar collisions in outer space, whatever your story is of how the solar system began, the gold was still there predating it. The gold and silver is mine is the line from the Bible that God said.
So as we explore space, do we run the risk in times ahead where we have another Spanish, South American gold inflation? Will we start mining asteroids?
Yeah, this is the argument that Bitcoiners always use when they're denigrating gold, that gold supply is going to go up as soon as we conquer outer space.
Yeah.
We're hundreds of years from that.
But also you need quite a lot of energy, and I suspect the energy cost will make that slightly it'll be problematic.
Exactly, it'll be totally prohibitive. If you've ever been to an actual gold mine, they're huge. And, huge drills and processing plants. So you can say, okay, well, we'll go there and we'll truck the ore back. A typical gold mine would be like 3 or 4 grams per ton of rock. So you're going to seriously truck thousands and millions of tons of gold back from outer space and then process it on Earth, or you're going to process it all in outer space. And then even if you do process it, gold's still extremely heavy. As you say, Tim, just the sheer logistics of mining it in outer space, we're just hundreds, if not thousands of years away from that.
The only thing that keeps me awake at night is the idea that an asteroid made of pure gold will smash into, ideally, Brussels, but I'd be willing to nominate a few other places as well. Absent that, I can't see a problem here.
Funnily enough, the Witwatersrand gold deposit in South Africa is like the most incredible gold resource in all history. It's about 40 kilometres long, 2 kilometres deep. It's responsible for about 40% of all the gold that's ever been mined. And it's what South Africa's economy was originally built on. And we tend to sort of think of South Africa as just a sort of basket case now, but it was such an incredibly wealthy place throughout the 20th century because of all the gold. One explanation is that was a meteorite that struck Earth. But now geologists seem to think that it was caused through underground rivers and something is what built up the gold deposit there. But yeah, I suppose a 40-kilometre long meteorite like the Witwatersrand could strike the Earth. You've still got to mine it.
There might not be anybody left after that kind of event.
Exactly.
Let's get on and talk about something a bit more recent. What's been the primary factor or the primary factors driving the gold price?
Well, I would say that the single biggest geopolitical event of the last quarter century is the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent NATO-led or US-led sanctions against Russia, which is ultimately a nuclear power, maybe not a superpower economically in line with the US or China, but as a mutual friend of ours pointed out, fairly soon after the invasion of Ukraine, even at the height of the Second World War, the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, the so-called central bank for central banks, never dared to sanction Nazi Germany's reserves. So at a stroke, the Biden administration basically torpedoed its own fiscal borrowing policies. So the geopolitical and financial impact of that can't be underestimated to the extent that, the US has now a national debt of $38 trillion, growing at the rate of something like $1 trillion every 100 days. It'll never be paid back. If it is paid back at all, it'll be paid back in devalued money. So the US is bankrupt. The entire G7 is bankrupt. We're all at various stages of bankruptcy, and Japan is probably further along than the rest of us. If you're one of the world's largest debtor countries and you basically send a signal that you can no longer be trusted and your treasury bonds can no longer be trusted, don't be surprised if the central banks that are leading the charge, if they decide they want to buy something else. I think the extraordinary thing about where we are is that central banks are leading the charge, but private and institutional clients are not even participants yet.
I would agree with that story with a couple of sort of minor nuanced differences. The BIS was still processing Nazi gold transactions as late as 1945. It's just incredible. But the Nazi US dollar assets were frozen, I think it was 1941 or 1942. So Nazi Germany was forced to use gold. But even so, freezing Nazi assets, the Americans were very slow to do that. And it's because they had so many business interests in Nazi Germany at the time, because they invested so much money rebuilding it after the First World War. But in any case, I would 100% agree with this gold market. But there was a marked low in 2022, about 2 or 3 months after America froze Russian US dollar assets. And from that point in mid to late 2022, gold has just gone up, up, up. And until 2025, retail, which normally drives bull markets, was not involved. And nor was institutional buying in the West. The buying was almost all coming from central banks. It's not like the Bank of England or someone was buying. The central banks that were buying were all banks along the Silk Road, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, China is obviously a huge trading partner of the US, but it is also a rival of the US. So it'd be too strong to say that China is an enemy of the US while they conduct so much trade with each other, whereas you could say Russia or Iran is an enemy of the US. So many of these countries that were buying the gold are not necessarily enemies of the US, but they're not total allies either. And so they just increase their central bank buying. After that, there's a word for it, which is de-dollarization, which is kind of self-explanatory, whereas central banks are reducing their dollar holdings and increasing their gold holdings. So 10 years ago, gold holdings as a proportion of central bank reserves were about 10%. A week ago, they were 30%. They've tripled in 10 years. Now, the reason they've tripled is because central banks have been buying in huge quantities, but it's also because the value of the gold holdings has increased. Yeah. So therefore, That's a factor as well. But the central banks have been the buyers at the margin, because central banks don't buy silver, central banks don't buy mining stocks. And it's only this year, 2025, that silver and the mining stocks have properly got going. I know silver was moving a bit before, but silver buying and mining buying comes from retail. So, retail was slow to this one and then obviously got in a big way in the last few months. And we've got this sort of little spike and now we're going through a corrective phase. What triggered it was the confiscation of Russian assets. Now, the first thing that gets weaponized in war is money. You can go back through every single war. When, the Americans rose up against the UK in 1780, whatever it was, the British printed loads of fraudulent American banknotes and flooded America with them, trying to destabilize the monetary system. The Nazis did the same with British banknotes in World War II. They were going to drop them all over Britain and they never actually got round to it. They printed them and they were trading throughout Europe. So I understand why America did what it did, because freezing Russian US dollar assets is a more peaceful way of standing up for Ukraine than going to war itself. It's a typical bureaucratic way of waging war. So I have some sympathy with that decision, but it is also hypocritical and it's totally backfired because it's undermined faith elsewhere in US dollar assets and particularly US dollar bonds, and it's triggered this bull market. I just think what we're seeing at the moment, gold's 3,900 as we speak, and it was 4,400 at the top. So it's corrected 10%. I think it could correct easily another 10, 20% in total, 25%, something like that. That would be typical of previous bull markets. You get a mid-cycle correction. But even so, I don't think this bull market's over. Gold isn't official money, but it's unofficially becoming official again, if you see what I mean, because
from what you're saying,
of the debasement trend, because central banks are buying it in such huge quantities.
History is almost repeating itself and the West is forcing China onto a gold standard almost, isn't it?
I certainly agree with what you said about what you could possibly call the remonetization of gold. But as you say, history is repeating itself because we're living through the 1970s all over again. I'm too young to remember the 70s as anything other than a child, but I do remember flares, appalling colour schemes. The whole thing was aesthetically was a disaster. But the price of gold and silver went up 22 times. So the idea that we're at sort of like all-time bubble tops, I think the problem is, firstly, that we're not even used to handling paper cash. We're used to tapping a device or tapping a card. So we've completely got away from what money really is. And I think it was Satyajit Das who described money as the abstraction of an abstraction is where it's got to next. It's not just electronic entries on an electronic ledger. Mm-hmm. So it's become intangible in a way that it probably should never have been allowed to. Either way, the 70s we had, a big monetary shock at the beginning. We had various wars. We had various social issues going on. And it was an inflationary decade and it was a problematic decade in many respects. And we know what happened to the gold price and the silver price in that decade. And I think we're literally living through, a carbon copy of that in almost every sense.
To Dominic's point, Tim, are you considering buying the dip? How do you gauge this?
So what we've done as a business is we've rotated some of our profits from silver mining stocks into other areas of the commodity sector, but we haven't really changed our stance in relation to either. It seems to us to be abundantly clear, whether you call it gold or whether you call it real assets. With every major government hopelessly insolvent, you can't own bonds. The bond market was a great place to be. The interest rate cycle was a great place to be for 40 years, and that bull run ended about 3 years ago. Anyone in the bond market in a major way should start to look for another avenue to go about their trade. These cycles tend to last quite a long time. So if we're in a secular bear market for interest rates and probably for inflation as well, real assets is the only game in town. So again, to go back to the 70s, stocks and bonds were a complete disaster during the 1970s because their post-inflation return was dreadful. If you're along the FT30 in 73 or 74, you had to wait about 15 years to get your money back. It was a disaster. I think we're living through exactly the same kind of experience. The only difference is it's worse this time because I think when the UK went cap in hand to the IMF for an emergency loan of, I believe it was something like $3.9 billion, which is a rounding error in today's money. But it was the largest loan, I think, that the IMF had given to that point. Our debt to GDP ratio was something of the order of sort of 35%.
That was the big difference.
It's about three times that now. So, if anything, the gold price has got even further to go than it did in the 70s.
I actually think where we are now is worse than the 70s. The difference with the 70s...
The fashion's marginally better now. But I noticed flares have come back. Flares are back.
But looking through the trousers, Tim, the difference with the 70s is that the starting point that everyone measures it from is $35 gold, which was such an artificial price. It's not true. And in fact, $850 gold in 1980 is also an artificial price because it just went there for like one afternoon. I was watching a video with some guy, I've forgotten his name, an American guy. I think he sold it. He caught the top of the market, maybe missed it by $20 or $30 or something. But, the following day it was at 600. So it was already 30% down. And it was the day that the Iranian hostages were released. It was the day after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. Russia had just invaded Afghanistan. The bond market had gone bananas. There's a million things happening all at once on that one particular day, plus gold fever. What did the rounds recently is, a lot of people were posting pictures of people queuing up to buy bullion outside bullion shops at the top of the market.
The meme top.
Yeah. But what happened in 1980 is everyone went to sell their gold. People went to the bullion shops to sell their gold and silver.
Yes.
And that was the big difference. So I keep saying it. What we saw was a mid-cycle correction, what we're going through now. I think our financial situation is more precarious than in the 70s because even though, fiat money is more entrenched than it was in the 70s. Remember, in the 70s, we're only a few years off the gold standard, which ended in 71. So gold was still present in people's minds. That was a temporary measure, and everyone thought we were going back to a gold standard. But now we're so far from that. But we just don't make anything. And this thing of reshoring American industry from China, it's going to take probably 2 decades and so much pain and so much inflation and so much expense. The skills aren't there, the industry isn't there, there's still too many regulatory barriers, which is one of the reasons manufacturing went east anyway, because the cost of regulation is so high. It's going to be 3 or 4 presidencies, and you have to assume that other presidents are going to want to have the same urge to reshore that Trump does. And there's no guarantee of that. We don't even know who the next president will be. So this reshoring is a massively painful and drawn-out process. It's going to involve so much monetary intervention of one kind or another, which is, a code word for debasement. I just think you want to be in gold and Bitcoin, non-government monetary assets. It just makes total sense to me. I don't see why you'd want to be anywhere else. People always ask me, well, what's your target for gold? $10,000? Well, maybe $10,000 in today's dollars. But you have to look at the other side of it, is what is going to happen to the dollar? We're all 3 of us from the UK, more so, what is going to happen to the pound? We forget this. Since 1971, the pound has been almost twice as weak as the dollar. So if you look at 1971 prices of things in the UK and compare them to things in the US and measure them in gold and so on, they've depreciated by almost twice as much in sterling terms. And in those days, the pound was $2.40, $2.50, $2.60. Now it's, $1.30 and it's feeling, or $1.35 maybe, and it's starting to feel expensive. Even just as recently as 2007, the pound was $2.10, and we're starting to think the pound's expensive at $1.35. I never trade bonds. I always felt it was immoral to own government bonds because you're enabling governments.
Me too.
Because it's so entrenched that bonds are a safe place because of this 40-year bull market and gilts and so on. I meet people and they're reluctant to invest in gold and Bitcoin, but they'll happily buy gilts. I'd like to ask you about the bear cycle in gilts and bonds and what the implications are.
So take a recent example. So the ill-fated Liz Truss administration, and I think she gets a really bad rap. I think she was stitched up by the civil service and the OBR and the Bank of England.
100% she was.
That year, between January and whenever that mini budget with Kwasi Kwarteng was announced, there is a 50-year inflation-linked UK government bond or gilt. Have a guess what happened to the price of that bond from January through to autumn of that year. It fell by 85%. Now, that's the so-called risk-free rate. And if that's the so-called risk-free rate, not for us, thank you very much. So again, we come back to that sort of that long cycle.
So when you say it fell by 85%, so
the price of the bond fell by 85%.
So I was holding something in my portfolio.
If you bought it at 100, if you bought it at 100, you could have sold that autumn for 15.
Bloody hell.
Bonds often don't behave the way you think they might. Firstly, people piled into index-linked bonds of any description because presumably they trust that the inflation measure the government's reporting is fair, whereas clearly it's just nonsensical.
Well, it's just bogus.
But also, you've got, as you say, you've got this mindset whereby bonds are still have this sort of race memory of being safe assets. But The only people who really are, I suspect, are holding bonds are because they're forced to by regulation. So if you're a pension fund, the regulator won't allow you to hold anything really other than sort of liability matching instruments, aka bonds. Happily for us, we're not managed by the pension regulator, so we can invest in whatever we think is appropriate. So we don't invest in bonds full stop. I do remember, I think it was around 2010 or so, I think there was a celebrated case, I think it was maybe Holland, the Dutch Glass Blowers Union pension fund had a portfolio chock full of gold. And the regulator said, you're going to have to get rid of all this highly volatile commodity nonsense and buy Dutch state loans. And they told them to piss off. They went to court and the pension fund won the case. So we're probably going to see capital controls now. So all bets are off with Rachel from accounts leading the charge. I think the only people who will be left owning bonds are those institutional entities that haven't got any choice.
Well,
everybody else will vote with their feet.
Rachel and Scott Bessent are both engaged in the same activity of trying to regulate into existence more balance sheet capacity that are price-insensitive buyers of bonds, whether it's stablecoin issuers or whether it is re-regulate or deregulating the banks. No rational person in this environment of currency debasement are going to buy them. So you've got to find people who are effectively forced to buy them. Coming back to the geopolitics, one of the things that occurred to me, I mean, we've established here that the debasement trade isn't over, but clearly we're going through a period of gold price correction. And the correction seems to have been impacted by FOMO from retail or this sort of meme local top that we've experienced. But what about the prospect of Trump and Xi shaking hands on a grand bargain? Is that a factor, do you think?
I think the politics is irrelevant. If you accept the thesis that there's too much debt in the system that can never be paid back, there's only really three outcomes that you can consider. One is that the governments engineer enough economic growth to keep the debt serviced. Good luck with that. Good luck with that in Europe.
I believe that can happen in America, but not in...
Maybe in America, but not in the UK or Europe under current administration.
Agreed.
The second option is that you default on it. Though you wouldn't call it that, you'd call it a restructuring or a jubilee. Yeah. But either way, you'd instantly bankrupt the banking and pension fund industry. So let's not go there. The third option is the option that every heavily indebted government throughout all of recorded history has resorted, which is you inflate the stuff away.
Yeah.
So I don't want to wax overly economic, but Ludwig von Mises, who is one of the great names of the so-called Austrian school, classical Austrian school, said that inflation is not an act of God or something that falls out of the sky like the plague. Inflation is a policy. We are living in a world of state-sanctioned inflationism. And for as long as we have central banks as the prime monetary actors, and we have fractional reserve banking where banks can create money out of thin air and then lend it at interest to all of their clients, and you're guaranteed to have inflation baked into the pie under that system. For as long as we operate with unsound money, unsound central banks, and unsound commercial banks, we are going to have currency devaluation. So gold will always be relevant for as long as we have that status quo perpetuating. In an ideal world, I would extinguish all central banks, but I think they may actually be in the process of doing that themselves because they may not survive this mess. The credit bubble, perhaps, is the biggest bubble in history. It dwarfs everything that we've seen beforehand.
So you're both hard money advocates. Could the world realistically return to a gold standard?
It may not have a choice.
So it might just by default.
There is a book called Gold, the Wants and Future Money. It has been an aberration for us to have lived in 50 years when the fiat monetary system has not been backed by anything, but that's the anomaly rather than the norm.
And it begs the question that is highlighted in Dominic's book about who owns the gold, because one of the most fascinating chapters in the book towards the end is where you speculate on how much gold China actually owns. And for that matter, how much gold does actually the US own? Elon's promise of a full audit of Fort Knox.
Well, I hope you're going to use your joke now, Dominic, because I love that joke about the Fort Knox audit.
Yeah. Come on then. Come on.
So the head of security goes to the US president. He says, Mr. President, there's no gold in Fort Knox. And the US president says, what do you mean there's no gold in Fort Knox? And the head of security says, there's no gold in Fort Knox. And the president says, double the guard. I'm going to be contrary, Tim. Let me put another argument to you about gold and gold standards, which is that in the 19th century and the 18th century and every century that preceded, gold and silver were both money. We used gold coins. We used silver coins. You know, you might not be spending your gold coins on a daily basis. You were certainly spending your silver or your copper on a daily basis, but we handled gold. And so there was paper money that was redeemable for gold. You know, the sovereign was still the pound coin. Gold was in circulation. In the gold standards of the 20th century, when the British and the European countries returned briefly to the gold standard in the late 20s and abandoned it again after the Wall Street crash in 32, around about then, we didn't mint a single sovereign, and we withdrew gold from circulation. So even though, like, a government could change its holdings for gold if it wanted to, ordinary people were not handling gold. There was no gold in circulation. It was only paper. It was just really problematic if you wanted to go to the Bank of England and redeem your notes for gold. So problematic as to be impossible. And then, of course, in America in 1933, Roosevelt confiscated American citizens' gold. So even though America was on the gold standard, American citizens weren't handling gold. And they weren't handling gold again until 1975, which was after America had departed the gold standard. So it was a bogus gold standard if ordinary citizens weren't handling gold. That's my comment about the gold standard of the 20th century. It was just bogus. And in any case, they printed way more money than they had dollars and pounds to redeem them anyway. So you come to this issue of gold as a store of value and gold as a medium of exchange. And gold as a store of value, it's doing its job. It's doing, you know, everyone's using it as a non-fiat alternative to store value. That it's already serving that purpose, that monetary purpose. We should use gold as a unit of account because gold is constant, and so it makes a much better unit of account than fiat, which is not constant. But in any case, we use fiat because we declare our taxes in fiat, and so we use fiat as a unit of account, even though gold is much more truthful. But the third purpose of money is to be medium of exchange. Now, for small transactions, you've never really used gold anyway. You've used silver and copper and nickel because there's just too much wealth in a small amount of gold. If you think of a 2p piece or a quarter, you think about how big that is, maybe a quarter of an ounce, that's about 700 quid, 650, 700 quid, more than $1,000 in a tiny coin the size of a quarter. So unless you're buying something expensive that costs 650, 700 quid, you're just not going to use that coin to buy stuff on a daily basis, hence using silver and copper and so on. But today, because of digital technology, everything has gone digital. So money's digital, books are digital, music's digital, paperwork's digital. You know, we store our office accounts in Excel spreadsheets on computer disks somewhere. We don't store them in boxes and folders and so on. Everything is digital. And so money is digital. So we don't use physical cash. I know some people still use it, but, you know, the norm is well over 90% of transactions take place using digital money. So if we were to go back to a gold standard, somebody would have to build a payment system on top of gold that is stored somewhere. Now,
that is possible now, though, in a way it wasn't in the past.
Yes, it is. It's totally possible. And it exists. There's a company called Tally that does it. There's Glint that does it. Gold Money had their own technology. I think there's 20 or 30 different cryptocurrencies that are gold-backed. But they all involve the storage of gold in a trusted vault somewhere and then using some kind of payment system built on top of it. So while it is a gold standard, it still involves a trusted third party. It's not
truly decentralized.
It's not decentralized, and there's a liability there. Whereas when you hold the gold in your hand, the physical gold in your hand, you know, there's no liability except, you know, mugging or whatever.
Oh, there's a risk. Yes.
Yeah, but there's no liability.
No, it's no one else's liability. Yep.
But a gold standard creates a liability. And so I just think sooner or later it'll fall apart because of the trusted third party thing. And so to go back to a payment system, I believe that governments might nominally back their money with gold or something, but a payment system built on top of gold, I think it's unrealistic.
But what we could plausibly go back to is some kind of regime where you have effectively let 1,000 flowers bloom. So as a libertarian, I'd say money is too important to be a plaything and a monopoly plaything of government. So we could go back to what I guess it was like maybe in the States in the 19th century. We have multiple currencies and some of them fail and some of them succeed.
Yeah.
Well, that seems to me to be entirely plausible as an outcome. Because
I think it's inevitable, actually. That's I agree with.
I think that the status quo, post-Bretton Woods regime is grinding to a halt before our eyes.
Friedrich Hayek wrote a was an IEA pamphlet called The Privatisation of Money. I think it was in 1976. And everyone thought he was completely mad. Everyone, it was the era of the UK was just getting its head around monetarism and Milton Friedman. And then Hayek sort of said, don't trust this Milton Friedman guy. He's a statist. He believes in aggregation of economic variables. Don't trust him. Why not just privatise it? Everyone thought he was crazy, but a lot of people would say that pamphlet was the precursor to Bitcoin. I mean, it was written before it had any notion of what the internet or even personal computers were.
Yeah, he argued that private bodies could issue government currency and they would be more trustworthy issuers than many governments.
Well, and think if, I don't know, would you trust an Amazon dollar above a US government, a federal
100%,
or a UK pound or an Amazon pound? I mean,
100% I trust Amazon.
I would suggest that one of the reasons we're in this mess is because most people, and alarmingly including most people in the financial service industry, don't understand what money is or where it comes from.
Yes.
Well, that's another thing too.
It does seem of late, reading articles in Bloomberg and the Financial Times, which I really must stop doing.
My all-time favourite is Willem Buita, who's at least twice now said that gold is a 6,000-year-old bubble.
Yes, yeah. Okay. Well, there seems to be almost a concerted effort between them to dismiss the idea of the debasement. I mean, I can't remember which one it was. I think it was the FT that went off. I think it was Alphaville, started saying the idea of a dollar debasement is clearly rubbish because the value of the dollar has actually gone up in recent months, which, of course, the value of the dollar has gone up relative to other fiat currencies.
Well, the FT's printed in pink for a reason.
I think I'll have to clip this bit out unless you explain yourself there, Tim.
Well, I suppose I'm conflating the FT's natural communistic impulses with
Fabian
impulses, perhaps. But this is the big joke that I think it was Jim Rickards that pointed out that the centralized state, the big state, the government-directed economy was tried and failed spectacularly in the 20th century with Russia and China. And the only place that it's still tolerated is in central banking and the Western financial system. It's a complete joke. And gold and Bitcoin are the solution to that.
That's the first time I've ever heard you say anything positive about Bitcoin, I think, Tim.
Well, I mean, my hands are slightly tied on this because not least because the regulator won't allow us to buy it, even if we wanted to. But again,
that's changing, isn't it?
I polish my libertarian credentials again, and I'd say let 1,000 flowers bloom. The only issue I have with Bitcoin is that it hasn't been around for 6,000 years. It's only 17 years old. So as I think I wrote recently, it's not even old enough to vote.
Or own a pair of flared trousers.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
But again, money is too important to be left to government. So I'm all for competition. I don't understand Bitcoin as profoundly as Dominic does, but I'd still rather have Bitcoin than US dollars or pound sterling or euros or yen or renminbi.
I'm an own both guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be either or. It can be and.
I've interviewed Charlie Morris, who is a big advocate of both. And it's quite interesting how the degree to which they are uncorrelated makes owning both very interesting and very useful. Just really wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about future plans and projects. Recently heard someone describe writing a book as the lowest ROI activity imaginable. But you've both done it, Dominic, multiple times. How would you describe writing a book? And would you recommend it? Or what advice would you give to someone who might be thinking about it?
My old publisher, Dan Kieran, always used to say that publishing a book is an exercise in disappointment. And I think he's absolutely right. And the capacity of this exercise to disappoint should not be underestimated. You know, you get really nice messages. Oh, it's a brilliant book. I loved it. I learned so much. It was so compelling, so readable, all this kind of thing. And that's what G's you up. But disappointment can come in from the most unexpected places. Even, for example, when you know there's a bit of a buzz around your book and Amazon have sold out, which is what's happened to me at the moment. But because of some logistical thing, Penguin can't get any more copies to Amazon. And in terms of the money you make, I think, you know, that's the ROI. You just don't make any money from books. But what a book does do, my agency, literary agency, is called Felicity Bryan, and Felicity Bryan is no longer with us, sadly. But I met her at a Matt Ridley book launch once upon a time, this old lady, and she used to say, I loved her, and she just went, your book is your calling card. it tells people you are serious. And I think there is that to be said for writing a book. But the problem with books generally is that you've got to make a choice between whether you read a book or you pick up your phone. Most people, most of the time, will pick up their phone. So even though we might be reading more than ever and reading more, essays and blogs and things like that, articles, we're actually not reading as many books in the way that we once did because we're listening to them more than we once did, which is something.
I would thoroughly recommend the audio version of your book, which is expertly narrated, Dominic. And
Thank you.
It is definitely worth whatever it is that my Audible fee represents for your
$7.99, I think it is.
Well worth it. Yeah. Tim, what about you? Any more books than you?
I don't know. I've done two. First one was called The War on Cash in 2015, and then Investing Through the Looking Glass in 2016.
Okay.
And I'd say the nice thing about them is it's a wonderfully cathartic exercise. So I managed to get an awful lot of grief out of my own system writing, especially the second one, because I had to pop at everybody, banks, central banks, politicians, you name it. So there's catharsis involved. But I think what Dominic says is absolutely right. It is perhaps destined to disappoint, but it depends what you're doing it for.
Yeah.
And if you're doing it just with a general intention of educating people, then just selling one is the result.
Yeah, that's true. I've got one more question for both of you, actually, if I may. Coming back to this thing of the bond market and, this impending currency
crisis.
Yeah, Bondageddon and the currency problems that we've got. Where do you see, and all the political stuff, which I'm sure you follow, where do you see us in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time? What kind of state are we going to be in? I'm talking specifically about the UK.
We've got to go to the edge politically and financially, and I don't think we're there yet.
One of the things I've found striking about the last 5 years is there's a real sense of spiritual renewal in a lot of the people that I speak to. And I wouldn't call myself a remotely religious person, but I'm starting to feel that there's something in the air. And I was struck very specifically by something, a lot of stuff, references from the Bible. And one of them was that it was news to me. I always thought that the terms Armageddon and apocalypse were synonymous, but they're not. So the interesting thing about that is that the Greek root for apocalypse is unveiling or unmasking. So I honestly think what we're living through is a great unveiling of the world as it really is, rather than as we thought it would be, or as we thought it was.
Yes.
And I think it's going to have to involve a complete evaporation or an extinguishing of all that we thought we knew about the world and the way finance works. And I'd like to think that with a following wind, we will see massive political change, massive economic change, massive financial change, and it will all be for the betterment of mankind. And if gold forms a part of that, so much the better.
Do you see wars ahead of us? Everyone goes, we're headed for a civil war, but I would kind of say we're already in a civil war, except nobody's got weapons. The only weapon we've got is words. I know the pen is mightier than the sword and all of that, but it's not like previous civil wars.
I think
language has been weaponized, hasn't it?
I think we've been at war
since true.
I think we've been at war since 2020. There's a guy called David A. Hughes who I've started to follow, and he's coined this phrase omniwar. I think our own governments are at war with their own citizenry, and that started probably easily as far back as 2016 over Brexit, and then was accelerated by COVID. Nobody trusts politicians anymore, nor should they. To circle back nicely to the discussion in question, we're all experiencing a sort of, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain moment. And that is, of course, from The Wizard of Oz, which is itself an allegory about sound money.
Yeah.
And gold and silver. These are timeless things.
Well, great. Thank you both very much for joining today. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Good luck with everything. I'm coming to see you at your Christmas special, one of the London dates in December, Dominic. So I'm looking forward to that. We're going to be cheering loudly. And Tim, thank you so much for your contribution too. It's been fascinating.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.